Well, hello. Sorry I can't see you, but it's very nice to be with you, if only in this virtual way. Ideally, though, not only would I rather be in New York, but ideally I'd rather be taking you to India, to Maharashtra, to meet some of Dr. Ambedkar's followers. I call them followers, but I think it's almost more appropriate to think of them as his children, for they certainly think of him as their father. They call him Baba Saheb, which is a sort of affectionate, fatherly kind of term. They greet each other and say goodbye to each other with the words Jai Bhim, victory to Bhim, Bhimrao, Ramji, Ambedkar, and feel their lives have been, even if they don't know much about him or much about Buddhism or much about his struggle, that their lives have been made not just better but possible thanks to what he did for them and what he did for them when he converted to Buddhism. I don't know how much background you've already had in this course that you're going through, so I'm just going to sort of jump in to 1935. He gave a talk in a town called Yeola, and during the course of the talk he made a declaration, a very important declaration. He said that unfortunately I was born as a Hindu untouchable, but I swear that I will not die as a Hindu. Now, he actually converted to Buddhism in 1956, so there was quite a big gap. And I'll talk a little bit about the gap, but also I'll say a bit about what led up to that declaration that he made in Yeola in 1935. He had an utterly exceptional education for somebody from his world, the untouchable world, the so-called untouchable world. And again, I'm going to have to rely on whether in your course you've already looked into untouchability, but if you haven't, and if you haven't read it anyway, I'll just recommend Arundhati Roy's masterful essay, The Saint and the Doctor, which is a kind of preface to a new edition of Dr. Ambedkar's essay, The Annihilation of Caste, recently published, very, very worth reading. It's a harrowing read, but really worth reading. So I'm going to assume that you know at least something of the background that Ambedkar came out of. He was born an untouchable, and like all untouchables, had very limited access to education, slightly more than many because of his father's job in a branch of the Indian Army. But he was the first child from the untouchable world to matriculate. I don't know how that would compare with the American education system, but it would be a sort of still relatively low, but good qualification for a child to have at the age of, I guess, of around 14, 15. Because he was spotted in this way, a benign Maharaja, the Maharaja of Baroda, awarded him a scholarship and paid for him to go to Columbia in New York, to the London School of Economics and to a university in Germany, where over the course of several years he qualified as a barrister and walked away with 2 doctorates in economics and I think law. So he returned as part of the deal to Baroda to take up a job in the Maharaja's civil service, and to his astonishment found that as he sat at his desk trying to do his work, the sort of the servants, the secretary class within the office, if he needed a book and it was their job to get it for him, or some legal precedent or whatever, they wouldn't come near his desk. They'd throw it at him because he was untouchable. And experiences like these in Baroda, as he tried to make his way, made him realize that there was no future for him in that world, no future for him, in a way, in any world, smeared as he was by the stigma of untouchability. So he went independent, set up his own legal practice, but then also started to do things like consciousness-raising talks. He would organize meetings of people from the untouchable world. He would set up educational institutions so that children from that world could get at least basic basic education. He established unions and established a political party. I've probably not even catalogued half of what he did in his attempt to create some kind of social context for people from that world to start organising themselves, start agitating, and having some effect, maybe, on the developing world around them. He was relatively successful. He became very well known. He became a considerable figure. As independence started to loom on the horizon, he was invited to some of the conferences that were taking place in India and in London to talk about how India would govern itself after independence. And in this context, and this is a kind of a very interesting and understated part of the story, he and Gandhi clashed very, very powerfully. And I think it's a useful thing to know, albeit I'm going to sketch it very briefly, though I'd refer you to Arundhati Roy's essay. For all his liberalism, his enlightened liberalism, Gandhi was a traditional Hindu and believed in the efficacy and value of the traditional Indian Hindu caste system. The main concession he made to the untouchables was to give them a new name, Harijans, the children of God. But actually he believed that the stability of society, the way most people could be happy in their lot, would be to follow their traditional Hindu dharma, their caste duty, and do the jobs, or be as menial or as unloved or as wonderfully successful and powerful as their caste duty allowed, with no opportunity for social mobility and so on. And of course Gandhi and Ambedkar therefore clashed extraordinarily. Ambedkar was the cause of one of Gandhi's fasts unto death. In a way, this was never really resolved between them. And don't remember, even Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu extremist, which perhaps gives us some idea of the fundamentalism innate within the Hindu world, which of course India is on the receiving end of, as I speak. But as it was obvious that Ambedkar was knowledgeable, was qualified, and of course was by the 40s the undisputed leader of the untouchable world, which numbered a substantial proportion of the Indian population. I mean, millions and millions of people. Nehru, for various reasons, thought it a good idea to have him in the new independent government, and in fact gave him the job of being law minister, but also chairman of the committee that drafted the Indian constitution, which is something that Ambedkar himself played a large role in forming. And that constitution, of course, outlawed untouchability, and it also reserved places in education and the civil service for people from untouchable or formerly untouchable backgrounds. Something like 15% of jobs, 15% of university places were to be allocated for people from that world. So you can think, good enough, there's some progress there. But to Ambedkar, it was obvious, and here we go back to 1935, he had learnt enough from his own experience and the experiences of countless people he'd met as he'd gone about his work of consciousness raising, politics, the law, and so on. He was very aware that the untouchable world was hopelessly and helplessly buried under mountains of age-old Hindu attitudes and habits. He was obviously pleased with himself. He was obviously proud of his achievement in becoming law minister, in having framed a constitution that outlawed untouchability. And if you go to Delhi, you will see a statue of him outside the Indian Parliament building with the constitution tucked under his arm, pointing the way forward. So a revered figure, but he knew that actually it wasn't going to make any difference. None of what he'd achieved so far, not even framing the constitution of a newly independent India, wasn't enough particularly when he considered how many people in India were living still in the villages where untouchability was being practiced on a not even daily basis, but minute-to-minute basis. So basically, he knew, and nothing in his life had convinced him otherwise, that there was no hope for this enormous number of people, 10% of the Indian population, unless they were to take up some kind of revolution. In his view, it would have to be a spiritual revolution. Of course, there's always been that thread within Indian politics of the kind of the communist vision, and there's no question that as independence loomed and became a reality, the Communist Party assumed that he would come along with his millions of followers into their fold. But he didn't believe in violent revolution. He was certainly capable of being angry, and if you see photographs of him, often you'll see him scowling. I think he probably contained bitterness, frustration, and yes, anger with a deeply, as he saw it, evil world. People who met him, who I've met, say that in their meetings with him, and they met him when they were children, because obviously people I've met, wouldn't have been his age, said that he was always incredibly kind and caring. But when Sangharakshita met him, to talk to him about the idea of perhaps converting to Buddhism, Ambedkar's first reaction was an angry scowl and to say, well, what's the point of converting to Buddhism in that in this country the institutions are run by Brahmins? And there was no question that he said it with some violence and some force. He had looked into other religions, and there are great anecdotes of how he was chased around the place by the leaders from the Christian world, the Sikh world and the Islamic world, trying to recruit him, because to increase, not least that they believed that they offered the best way forward, but any group that got a few more million people into their fold was going to have an awful lot more influence and power within Indian society. But for Ambedkar, he always had this feeling for Buddhism, but was frustrated by the fact that Buddhism was still so, in India at least, still pretty much dead, and where it was alive in an institutional way was often in the hands of Brahmins. And it was very much, I think, the influence of his conversations with Sangharakshita that got him to see that there was a way through that, there was a way beyond that. What he was looking for was a religion, because he did think the answer lay in religion. Well, I'll just say a little bit there. Forgive me if this isn't utterly clean, but I'm kind of doing it from memory rather than from notes. The true revolution, as he saw it, had to be a revolution of the individual human heart. He admitted that such a revolution, brought about by a spiritual and moral conversion, a real one, an authentic one, not just a nominal one, would be the only way in which people would move forward in themselves and would therefore get together and collaborate in a way that was truly effective and creative and benign. So he wanted a religion that ennobled the human being. He wanted a religion that ennobled moral values, universal moral values, not just the moral values of one particular cult. After all, the Manusmriti, a core text of Indian lifestyle, advocated that an untouchable, if hearing words from the sacred Vedas, should have their ears removed or have molten lead poured into their ears. I mean, that was the world that he was trying to escape from. So he was looking for a way forward that would help people to discover their way into a truly universal, authentically moral position, but which would be rooted in their own experience and their own vision of their own possibility, and more broadly the possibility of human life. He also felt that, you know, if it was to be a religious conversion, and if it was to be off the peg rather than founding a new one, then it ideally would be an Indian religion. And of course, therefore, you know, Buddhism was center stage. He spoke often of liberty, equality, and fraternity. I mean, if there were a couple of trilogies in Ambedkar's life, one was educate, organize, agitate. The other one, sorry, I got that wrong, educate, agitate, organize. Very important distinction. And the other one was liberty, equality, fraternity. When people said, well, he's just borrowed that from the French Revolution, he said, no, those values I got from my master, the Lord Buddha. And this was something he said, you know, relatively early on in his life, that he saw that Buddhism didn't ennoble poverty, like a lot of religions do. It spoke directly to the individual human heart. It gave people ways of absolutely asserting on sound, universal moral principles that people are all born equal, and that therefore they had no need to live with the stigma of their former untouchability, that they really were free, and this is where freedom comes in, you know, to plumb and you know, seek to fulfill their highest, deepest potential. And you know, in recognizing that equality, in recognizing their common humanity, they had the best chance of coming together, collaborating, and being effective in the future of India. Because something that the caste system has done has been to create not just a society that's highly fragmented in terms of caste and subcaste, it's just a society that by its nature fragments. It's almost impossible to do anything, you know, collective in India without factions and schisms emerging all the time. I mean, sadly, this is, you know, this has been, you know, part of the story of the Buddhist, the Ambedkarite Buddhist world since 1956, when the mass conversion started. But his vision was that if people really practiced the Dharma, they would find their own way to freedom on an individual level, they would recognize their common humanity, and they would know how to collaborate with others and learn how to be effective. Something that increasingly struck me as I sort of encountered Ambedkar in texts, in his talks, in reading about him, talking to people who have been so influenced by his life. His vision was, of course, for his people, the former untouchables. But it was bigger than that. It was at least for the whole of India. He knew that India, as it became independent, was inevitably going to go through huge transformations. He could see too that the world, you know, the world of the 50s, was at a turning point. You know, there was a new world coming. You know, he could sort of intuit that it was going to be a world where consumerism, distraction, superficiality, you know, was going to be much more the rule rather than tradition. And he looked at that world with real scorn, and I think with real fear that it would provide, you know, an open ground for populists and so on. And saw his people not just as elevating themselves, but as in time becoming the moral exemplars of independent India. His vision went that far. That said, it's really important to get it that Ambedkar didn't think it would be quick. You know, he didn't believe in a bloody revolution, hence his rejection of communism. He had no time for the dictatorship of the proletariat. That was, in the end, just a dictatorship. You know, he said that you can't take shortcuts in this kind of life. Shortcuts are dangerous. And he said, the way I'm choosing, it's not direct. It's going to have many, many diversions, many complications, but it's going to be the only safe way forward for any hope of real change. He was a quite extraordinary man. And even what I've told you in this very brief talk, I hope I've not gone too much over time, is probably more than a lot of his followers know. The conversions are still taking place, by the way. Initially, most of the converts, which was around 9-10 million, in the early years, came from his own subcaste, the Mahar caste. But now, not least, because of the work being done by our movement there, conversions are continuing. People are moving into a Dharma life from all over the states, not just in Maharashtra and not just from the Mahar caste. The story is just beginning, and interestingly, Ambedkar's own star, so to speak, despite the influence of BJP, and the more fundamentalist Hindu narrative, Ambedkar's star is rising. He's probably taken much more seriously these days than he was by non-Mahar people, than he was back in the 50s. But that's a whole nother thing, as they'd say. Yes, as I said at the beginning, I'm so sorry I can't transport you all to India to meet people who, whether they knew him, it may be their parents converted or their grandparents these days converted. There's an influence, there's a thread, not least because they're Buddhists, not least because they have now spent years, some of them all their lives, outside of the definition of being untouchable or even ex-untouchable. They might still proudly call themselves Dalits, people from the oppressed world, but they have a confidence, an energy, a vision, for what their life could be, what life can be, that's just thrilling to be part of. When I came back from India, whether it was the first or second time of a substantial stay, I can remember saying to friends, it's a required experience to spend time among those people, the so-called new Buddhists of India. It's so exciting, so inspiring. I really hope that at some point, whether it's through this little talk or other talks you hear, you'll at least look into it more and maybe even make your way out to India to spend some time in that world among those people, among the followers of Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. Anyway, lovely to talk to you. I hope you're all well, staying safe, and that somehow or other we'll see each other before too long. Bye-bye for now.